Well, friends, I'm delighted today to have a dear, I almost want to qualify it as remote or virtual, but I really don't feel like those things interfere with our relationship because I've known Shari Suter now for, I don't know, probably 4 years or five. I'm not sure if the time just gets away from us, but I think it was probably almost certainly through the channel called Grail Country, if maybe not before. All of us seem to sort of come out of the stream of Paul Vanderklay in some point
Right.
or another. But yeah, we met along the way, and just the first time I heard Shari talk and share, it's like there was a real resonance in my heart with her story and her perspective and her insights. So I'm just so delighted and honored that Shari is with us today. And as I told her before we started, that I basically just want to say, Shari, tell us your life story because I've heard bits and pieces of it. And I want to hear the fuller version if possible today. So I'll interrupt here and there, I'm sure, for clarification, or
Good.
maybe points of interest. But Shari, I'll turn it over to you. Yeah, I did mean to mention that, yeah, that you are from British Columbia, correct? Is that
Right.
okay? It's a big place.
It is a big place.
Yes. And so we're like 2 hour difference and that sort of thing. But in spirit, I feel like we are next door neighbors. So,
Yeah.
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 So Shari, please just share your story with us.
Well, there's all kinds of stories in the story, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Want to hear them all.
um, yeah, I can give a brief biography. I was
Sure.
born in 1962, best year ever.
Yeah.
And I was born in Toronto, Ontario. And my parents were very young when they got married. They were 18 and 19.
Wow.
They always joke that they couldn't even drink at their wedding because they weren't the drinking age yet.
Yeah.
Um, and I came along a year later. So so I was raised by very young parents, and I have three other siblings. I have a sister who came 2 years later, and a brother who it's his birthday today, actually.
Right.
And I'm really bad at math. He was born in 68 and then another brother in 72. So there's kind of a little gap there. Um, we moved a lot. So for various reasons, I think mainly because my dad was just trying to work his way up into some kind of substantial, you know, provider role for his family, right? Like
Yeah.
to be able to get a good enough job. He had four kids and a wife.
Yeah.
And so we followed work around, and it wasn't always the same work. He did a lot of different things. So we moved a lot.
Mm.
And I don't know how it is for you, but when I turned 50, I started thinking back to, you know, things like that, like, oh yeah, we moved all the time.
Yeah.
Is, you know, you kind of get it's your normal and you don't really think about it until you meet other people who say things like, well, I never moved.
Right.
I grew up in the place I was born.
Yeah.
Um, and and then you wonder how much of those childhood experiences actually, formed you as a person. And I think I think a lot of things did, for sure. But I actually think moving was a big factor,
Mm.
because we often moved when in the middle of the school year. So it was
Mm.
whenever he had a job offer or something came up that he wanted to pursue.
Right.
And so we were kind of torn out of a familiar space and thrown into a very unfamiliar space. And for children, that's difficult,
Yep.
right?
Right.
And My brothers didn't have it as much as my sister and I, because, like I said, there's a pretty big, like, my youngest brother and I are 10 years apart, right?
Mm. Wow.
And my parents got more and more settled as time went on, but I just remember those many times where I sat in an empty classroom waiting for the kids to come in from recess and stare at me because I was the new kid in the middle of the year, you know?
Yep.
And I remember having conversations with myself about, who am I? Like, from that age, like
Mhm.
really young,
Yeah.
you know? And and I always opted to just be myself. Actually, one time, I'm always embarrassed to tell this story, but one time it was, what grade was it? Fifth grade. Oh, it was at a time when they had these experimental classrooms in Canada, and they put two grades together. So it was fifth and sixth grade. And these were like the upper echelons of primary school, right?
Yeah.
And and I never felt like a cool kid, just to be honest, like, to be clear, like, I never felt like a cool kid, but I also didn't really bemoan the fact that I wasn't a cool kid. I thought the cool kids were kind of superficial.
Mhm. Mhm.
But for some reason I felt like there had to be something cool about me, right? In order to fit in this new classroom.
Mhm.
And so I remember sitting with this group of kids, first day, middle of the year, and everyone sat at these round tables. So there was like 8 children per table. And I was sitting there with all these kids. And I don't even remember how the conversation came up, but I ended up telling them that I wrote with my left hand, that I was left-handed.
Mhm.
And that was my, like, claim to fame. And I wasn't left-handed, okay?
Yeah.
I was right-handed.
Right.
And
Mhm.
the teacher was walking by, and he overheard me, and he said, "You're not left-handed." And I said, "Yes, I am." And now I had to dig in, right?
Right.
Because all the kids were watching. And so he said to me, "Okay, write your name then on this piece of paper." And so I did with my left hand. And it was obvious that I wasn't left-handed
Yeah.
to him anyway,
Right.
but I did it,
Yeah.
and it was legible,
Yeah.
right? And so for the whole rest of that year, I wrote with my left hand.
Wow.
Like, I had to keep up and I remember learning after that, okay, no, never again. I'm never doing that again.
Yeah.
Because it was physically torturous.
I bet. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, back to the who am I question. That's always been a question that I've had, and I could go even further back into my childhood, to the time that I was 5 years old, and I had a conversation with God, um, because I was thinking about dying, and I think a lot of children do, at, it's somewhere in that 5 to 10 year range, start thinking about dying, and and I had I had a very impactful, I would call it at this point, a mystical experience, because because God basically told me, well, I came to the realization that my body dies, but the thing that is me doesn't die.
Mm.
And it was kind of like a combination of a vision and a realization. Like, when these things happen, I think they're hard to parse. Like, you can't really say what came first, and I just knew that there was, uh, what I came away with from that experience was that um that I was forever. There was something about me that was forever,
Mhm.
and it was forever because God made me and he loved me. And it was because of that love that I remained, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so, like, when I think about the Christian part of my story, it begins there for me. because I went away from that experience never doubting the existence of God, never doubting the afterlife, never doubting I didn't even like to call it immortality, but let's call it immortality, right? And so yeah, so I just kind of walked in that knowledge. And my parents at the time, my mother grew up with a Christian mom, and went to a Baptist church and went to Sunday school, and did all that stuff. My dad, I would say his dad was an atheist. I don't know about his mom actually.
Mm.
Um, and they were part of the United Church, but they never attended, you know. And so every now and then my parents would make a concerted effort to find a church and go somewhere, but it would last for maybe 3 weeks and then it was over, you know. And so I like to say, my mother doesn't like it when I say this, but I like to say that I grew up in a non-Christian home, because essentially I did. I mean, we talked about God, and it was like there wasn't an agnosticism about whether God was real or not. Like that was kind of a given, right?
Yeah.
But it didn't really go any deeper than that.
Mm.
And yeah, so I don't know if you want to hear the Christian story or if you just,
I want to hear it all.
you know. Well, yeah, so we moved a lot. I really hate talking about myself. But
This is for your mortification,
my mortification, okay.
Your
I
story
was
is so wonderful, though. I mean, really, but I understand what you mean.
yeah. As a person, as a child, I was um very inquisitive and curious, and that curiosity got me into a lot of trouble. Kind of naive, innocent type troubles,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Like I remember one time waking my little sister up, who was like 2, and taking her outside in the middle of the night to look for the Easter Bunny because I was sure he was real, you know. And I think we lived in an apartment building, and nobody could figure out how I got out of the locked security door,
Right.
you know. And some man showed up at my parents' apartment with these 2 little girls at like 5 a.m. saying, "Are these your children?" So, and my family likes to tell all these kinds of stories because I was doing those things all the time, right? I was always looking for something. I was always curious about this, and it never felt wrong to me to pursue that kind of curiosity,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I don't feel like I've ever lost it, and I think that little child is like alive and well,
Yeah.
in me.
Yeah. That's so beautiful.
Still there,
Yeah.
still there. When people ask me how old I am, I just tell them I'm 14. But yeah, so there was there was that. Um when I was 14, my parents got saved, and they got saved into a Plymouth Brethren assembly.
Yeah.
In the live stream this morning, they were talking about pastors and churches, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, I went to a church that didn't even like pastors.
Right.
They didn't have a pastor. They had teachers,
Yeah.
right? Um,
Do the brethren
and
do they even have like a paid position that's a pastor of any kind, or is it just all basically
all
elder?
elders.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they take turns preaching. And the Lord's table is kind of anybody can stand up and share during the Lord's table.
Yeah.
It's actually reminiscing on the Lord's table in the Brethren assemblies was a fond memory for me, because there
Mm,
was something very intimate about it. They used to put the chairs in a circle and the table in the middle, and although women weren't allowed to speak, but
mm, yeah,
but and then people would just stand up and say, "Can we sing this hymn?" And or they'd read a psalm, or they'd share something that was on their heart,
right,
and it was really nice, actually.
yeah,
Um, yes, so that was happening in my parents' lives, and I was not thrilled about it. I was 14. I was already well on my way to, it was, what was it? What year was it? It was 1976. 1976.
yeah,
And it was rock and roll, and drugs, not sex, but rock and roll and drugs and hanging out at the pool hall, and
right,
all that kind of thing.
yeah,
And and so we clashed. My parents and I clashed, just to put it bluntly. And I don't really want to get into all the details, but it was pretty traumatic, and I think for both of us, for both parties.
right,
And after 3 years of it, I just opted to leave home. So I left home at the age of 17,
mm,
and basically just well, actually, I went to a town that we had previously lived in, because I had a friend there, and got my first job ever, as I was a bit of a paradox, because as dark as the world was that I was participating in, I was not a dark person.
mm,
I was naive, I was childlike.
right,
And there was an authenticity to the world that I was in
mm,
that I didn't find in these Christian circles.
mhm,
And for that reason, I didn't have any respect for it. I had none
yeah,
whatsoever.
yeah,
I just saw a lot of people striving to attain some kind of station, or to be perceived as good and true, you know, and um, but yeah, and I just saw a lot of hypocrisy,
mhm,
basically,
right,
right? And the people I hung out with, they were who they were.
yeah,
Like, they weren't pretending to be anything else, you know?
right,
So so I was attracted to that more than anything, more than anything.
mm,
Um, yes, so then I did some crazy things, like from the age of 17 till I was 19. I hitchhiked all over Canada, like
mm,
from the Yukon all the way to Ontario. I ended up living in Prince Edward Island, so it was like coast to coast, which is a huge
yeah,
distance.
right,
Had lots of, amazing experiences, and lots of close calls, and
mhm,
all kinds of things like that. And then I got pregnant, and I knew I couldn't have an abortion. I knew I couldn't do that.
mm,
Um, because I knew God was there. I knew that this being was something that never died,
yes,
you know? And I didn't have the right to decide that, or to take its physical life, right, from it. And so I opted to keep the baby, but I had no clue. Like, I was in a place where I wasn't even earning my own living at the time.
mm,
And now I had to earn my living for me and someone else.
yeah,
Anyway, my parents my parents offered for me to come home, and I told them I would, but they couldn't force this round peg into a square hole, you know. And so if they could meet those conditions, then I would come home. And I had every intention of bettering myself so that I could, like I didn't remain in the place where I got pregnant. I moved away from it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then in that time period that I was pregnant and waiting for the baby to be born, I got back to my parents when I was about 5 months pregnant. And in that 4 months before she was born, I was thinking to myself, geez, I need to give this kid something to hang on to so that all the things that happened to me don't happen to her,
Mm.
you know? And and then I thought, well, I'll start with reading the Gospels and maybe I'll just extract some really good advice out of it,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
And and I started with Matthew, and by the time I got to the book of John, I was madly in love with Christ,
Hmm.
with
Wow.
Jesus.
Yeah.
I was totally in love. Like, I don't know if it was my hormones or what,
Yeah.
but but I was just like, who is this person? Nobody could say the things that he said, approach someone in the way that he did,
Mm.
leave someone in the way that he did, all the things that he did,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And of course, the whole time I'm living with my parents, they're saying, "Would you like to come to church with us on Sunday?" And I'm like, "No,
Yeah.
thanks."
Right.
An unwed mother in a brethren assembly of like 50 people. No, thanks.
Oh, man.
So and I never told anybody that I was reading my Bible, and I never told anybody the experience I was having with Christ, and it was
Mm.
very intimate, and we were, my prayer life became a conversation, right,
Mhm.
that went on all day long.
Wow.
And I was just hit with these waves of admiration and love and,
Mm.
you know, um, awe,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah.
It was awe. And then I had my baby, and I went on welfare. I remember, so I wasn't on welfare before that because I was living with my parents,
Mhm.
but I applied for welfare when she was born. And I told the social worker that I was just going to be on welfare for this first 6 months, and then I was going to get a job. And she goes, okay.
Mhm.
She's like, whatever. And and then when my daughter turned 6 months old, I called her up and I said, okay, I'm done now. I'm going to get a job. And she
Mm.
was like, what? And I remember she came by we had to fill out some paperwork. And she was just like, I have never, oh my God, people, this is what the system is for, she kept saying.
Right. Right.
And
Mhm.
and then I got my own place. And because I was really quite determined to, this is what I'm doing. Like, I don't need to drag other people into it. It's not their responsibility. I'm taking this responsibility on, and
Yeah.
that's what I did. And then this whole time I'm just having this beautiful relationship with Jesus, and I'm talking to him and I'm asking him questions, and
Mm.
he's teaching me in dreams and visions.
Mm.
Okay?
Wow.
That's how I'm learning. And and every now and then, I remember my sister came over one night, and she had gone back to high school because she ended up traveling around with me too at one point. She was back in high school, and she was doing homework or something, and then she said, "I'm going to do my devotions now. Do you mind if I read them out loud?" And this was everyone was trying to save me, eh?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's how well hidden my journey was
Yep.
to everyone. And I said to her, "No, you can read your devotions to yourself, please." I got a lot of conversation going on
Right.
up here.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. And then I ended up, my parents had a bakery and I ended up working for my parents, and which was like just so great of them because I lived down the road. I could walk to work. I took my daughter with me, and it was, family business, and it was, it was wonderful.
Right.
And then and at one point I remember I started talking more about asking questions, talking about God. And I remember at one point thinking, every time I open my mouth, I'm quoting someone else. Like
Mm.
I'm saying, you know, Dr. So and so said, or my dad said, or the preacher said, or whatever, right? And I thought, what do I think? What?
Yeah.
And so I couldn't think of any way to figure that out except to go to Bible school because that was the culture that I was in,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And so I applied to some, I think it was one of them was Moody, and I just got the strict no answer because I was an unwed mother, right? And that that's just not something they knew how to deal with.
Right. Yeah. Mm.
And so I ended up going to, I'm not sure, are you familiar with Major Ian Thomas?
Oh, yeah. I heard him
Okay.
speak in Colorado. I was in the Air Force and in
Oh
training,
yeah, they have a
and he
school
was
there.
at a local church there, and I got to hear him speak. And I'm sure I purchased at least one or two of his books, that sort of thing. But yes.
Okay, well, he started an organization called Cape and Ray. Um, well, actually, it wasn't called Cape and Ray. The original building in England was Cape and Ray Hall, and it was called Torchbearers. That's what it was
Hmm.
called.
Yeah.
And so essentially, schools, they were called schools. They popped up all over the globe, Torchbearers schools, right?
So, yeah.
And the program was a 1 year program, like a fiscal year.
Mhm.
And you had guest lecturers, you lived together, you ate together, and you had one work day a week together. And Sunday was the day of work, a day of worship.
And so,
And everybody had to choose a church within the community to go to. So you couldn't, it wasn't insular in the sense that they
yeah.
just worshiped at the school, but everybody had to go out and go to church and come back.
So,
And so I contacted them, and they were gung ho to have me, and I was just shocked because I was
yeah.
really really discouraged at the time.
Right.
And I said, well, I got to save up the money, and I'll let you know if I can manage it.
Yeah.
And it was getting close to the time when I would have had to register, formally. And I called them up and I said, I'm not going to make it. I just don't have the money. And they
Right.
said, come. They said, come anyway. So
Well,
I was like, really? Okay. And I was thinking, do I want to leave there with a debt? And then I thought, I'm not even gonna think about that. I'm just gonna go.
yeah.
This seems like something's opening up for me, and I'm gonna go.
Right.
And
Mm.
so I went with my daughter, and then about 2 or 3 months into the program, I got a note in my mailbox saying that an anonymous donor had paid for all my tuition, and I owed
Mm.
them nothing,
Wow. It's wonderful.
which was really amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and of course, I asked all the usual suspects, did you do it? Did you do No. And
Right.
nobody I knew did it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Wow.
yeah. And then, and that was where I met my husband, Wayne. I
See.
met him at that school.
Okay.
And so his story is kind of interesting because he grew up in a little village in Switzerland. And in that village was a torchbearer school
Hmm. Wow.
run by a Swiss couple.
Mm-hmm.
And they had mostly American students coming in.
So,
And so for these local kids, this was something very exotic, right? And Americans, like,
yeah.
you know, and so of course the director of the school, who was from the village, he would open up to the local kids to come in for Bible studies or volleyball games or youth group nights or whatever,
Right.
right?
Yep.
Because part of the experience, I think, for a lot of people going into these other countries was to, experience the local life, right?
Yes.
And so my husband, and he grew up in the Swiss Reformed Church, which is the official Protestant denomination in Switzerland, right?
Mm.
His parents were, well, I would say his dad was an atheist. His dad was really antagonistic, actually, towards God, kind of a mocker of God.
Mm.
But interestingly enough, his mother was a Methodist Christian, which was considered a sect in
Right.
Switzerland,
Wow.
right? And
Yeah.
so I don't know what their story was, but
Right.
anyway, and so my husband kind of grew up this lonely little Christian guy in his family, you know.
Mm.
And anyway, a friend of his from his village went to the school on Thetis Island where I was
So,
the year before I got there.
all
She
right.
was there for a full year before I got there.
Yeah. And
And then
where is the Thetis Island? Is it
Thetis Island is in the Gulf Islands off the coast of Vancouver Island.
okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, and then she decided to stay on an extra year as a staff person.
So,
And so my husband was traveling through the States for a full year with a friend. They bought a car and they were camping out and they were just traveling around.
yeah.
And they decided to swing by and visit Claire because she was their friend and who they grew up with. And my husband, it was kind of towards the end of their America trip, and he wasn't really keen on going back to Switzerland. And he found out that he could stay with longer with a student visa
I said
because there was student visas available to attend the school.
right.
So he thought, well, that's a great opportunity. And he was familiar with torchbearers, right?
Yep.
So it wasn't like a totally unique situation to him. And so he thought, well, I'm just gonna go to the school for the year. And so he came
Mm.
and we had a very fairy tale like romance. Like it was just like he was not at the school for a full month after it started because he was still traveling and had to wrap up
Right.
that with his friend. And so when when the school started, they had a board with everybody's photos and names underneath so that you could, not have to ask every 5 minutes,
Right.
what's your name,
Yeah.
right? And eventually all the pictures came down except one, and it was his picture, right? Because he wasn't there yet.
Oh,
And
okay.
then there was a big announcement made that he was arriving the next day and everyone should make him feel as welcome as possible,
Mhm.
right? And so we were all lined up at the dining hall, and I was holding my daughter,
Yeah.
and and he was sitting on a park bench, and I remember looking at him going, "Oh my God, he's so good looking." It was like love at first sight.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I said to a friend of mine, I said, "Here, you hold the baby. I'm going to greet the new student."
Right.
And so I sat down beside him and I said, "Welcome to this," and I'm all, blah, blah, blah,
Right.
and and he just kind of looks at me and I said, "Do you speak English?" And he goes, "Of course." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And he sounded so arrogant, right? And I was
Oh
just
my.
like, "Oh, this is
Right.
disappointing."
Yeah. Yeah. Oh,
Ah. So, and then we had another exchange, I don't know, a couple weeks later in the
right.
cafeteria. And I got the same feeling of, it was like, I said something like, "Are you going to be a missionary after this?" And he goes, "That's not my style," or something like that. And I was like, "Oh, well, excuse me."
And what is his name?
His name is Ulrich.
Ulrich. All right.
Ulrich.
Good.
Yeah. So anyway, I had these such mixed feelings about him, and but I couldn't shake the fact that I felt really drawn to him. Now, at the same time, and actually for probably a full year before that,
Mhm.
actually even longer. Okay, my daughter was 16 months when I attended the school. So about 6 months after she was born, and I moved out on my own, and I was all alone. Nobody was in the house. I was raising the kid. I was staying up all night. I was, doing all the housework. I was buying the groceries. Like, I remember thinking, oh, I can't do this by myself. You know,
Yeah.
I need a husband.
Yeah.
And I started praying for a husband.
Yeah.
And then, people would approach me, my mother, my sister, and, you never go anywhere, Sherry. You should go on a date, you know? And I'm just like, oh God, no. And so I said to the Lord, I said, okay, listen, here's the deal. I'll get ready for the husband. You bring it on. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So that's what I did. I remember, okay, I'm going to learn how to garden. I'm going to learn how to can. And I started buying these like really nice cookbooks and
Mhm.
I'd cook up these really beautiful meals just for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and just, keeping my own books and saving and just all that, and it was all in prep, right? And I was like living this life of total faith that God was going to bring me a husband.
Yeah.
As long as I kept up my end of the bargain, like
Right.
I had to keep preparing, right?
Right.
So so here I am at the school, and I'm confronted with all my feelings, but I also have this deal with God, right? And I'm like, okay, you know what? I can't interfere. This is God's thing. And if it's meant to be, it's meant to be,
Yeah.
right? And and so he and I didn't really spend any time together at the school. And I was there was a married couple at the school, and he hung out with the husband, and I hung out with the wife.
Mm.
And they did it, and not together, right? Like him and Ian would go fishing or, you know, rock climbing or whatever, and
Right.
and and Sandy and I would do laundry and knit
That's good.
because I had a kid, right?
Yeah.
And and so it was like we hung out with these two people, but we never really hung out together. And then winter came, and there was a cabin on the island that one of the residents owned, and he offered it to Sandy if her and her husband ever wanted to just get away from the school for
Right.
a night or two or whatever.
Yeah.
And so she said, why don't me and Sherry and Uli and Ian, why don't we go and cook a meal at the at Hunter's cabin, you
So,
know, just because we were sick of the cafeteria
yeah.
food. And so that was the first time I spent any time with Uli. That's his the short form of his name.
Yeah.
And and I would say we did that maybe 3 times. And by the third time, and I'm getting really personal here. I hope I'm not embarrassing you
No, not at all.
but I was so in love with him. Like it was just brutal. And at one point, I said to my friend Sandy, who knew him, okay,
Yeah.
and me, and I said to her, there is someone I'm so in love with, and I just don't know what to do about it. I'm just dying inside. She
Mm.
goes, really? Someone at home? Someone back home? Like that's how much I showed it,
Oh my.
right? And I said, yeah, yeah. She goes, oh, that must be so terrible for kind of thing.
Right.
So anyway, on this one third visit to this cabin for dinner with them, it became apparent that he was interested in me, and I reciprocated. Okay, but nobody noticed.
Yeah.
It was all like under the radar.
Yeah.
And, and so then we drove from the cabin back to drop me off at my cabin with my daughter because actually she was staying with another single mom who had a little guy. And he got out of the car and they assumed he got out to let me out.
Mm.
And then he closed the door and Ian said, aren't you getting back in, Uli? And he said, no, I'm going to walk Shari to her cabin. And I was just like, right? Because I'm thinking, I have asked God for a husband.
Right.
Like that's what I'm thinking. And I know it sounds really idealistic, but that's just how I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, and I remember looking at him going, do I want to look at that every morning when I wake up? So anyway, we get to the cabin and I'm getting some blankets so I can carry my sleeping daughter back. I had to go pick her up at this other girl's cabin, which was just next door.
Yeah.
And he's standing on the porch. And my heart's racing and I'm going, Lord, is this it? Like and then I ended up giving him a kiss. I initiated it and I knew right away that was like really not good. And then I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that." And I said, "Listen, I've been praying for a husband and I know God's going to give me one. So I'm not interested in a little fling, in a little Bible school fling or whatever."
Right.
And he looked at me and I thought he was just going to hightail it, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And he looked at me and he said, "Well, I've been praying for a wife." And I said, and so he asked me to marry him
Right there.
right there.
Wow. That's
First kiss.
amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
I said, "So does this mean what I think it means?" He goes, "Yeah, it does."
Oh my goodness. That's
So that's my
wonderful.
little whirlwind romance, of course. Yeah. And then, but we never got married for 2 more years because he went back to Switzerland. He wanted to get a good job.
Yeah.
He was unemployed, so he needed to find a new job. And in between those 2 years, I ended up traveling to India with the director of the school that I was attending on Thetis Island
So,
and the director of the Colorado school,
mm.
who was Chris Thomas, Major Thomas's son.
I see.
So Chris Thomas and Charlie Fordham and me went to India, just the three of us, and did because Charlie came from he was born to missionary parents,
I see.
and he would go back every year and do like a mini Bible schools for pastors and evangelists.
I see.
What an experience that was, because we
Mm.
went into some really far-reaching places.
Yeah.
And I'll just tell you one little story. We were in this tiny little village on the edge of a big like national park where they had elephants come into the cornfield one day and everybody had to chase them out, kind of
Yeah.
thing. And we were in a hut and we were all sitting on the floor and all these pastors or evangelists, and these guys never went to Bible school. They were just men who came to know Christ and started preaching the gospel.
Yes.
And some of them couldn't even read or write. Okay.
Mm. Mhm.
And this man showed up. He rode a bicycle there that had no tires on it.
Oh my goodness.
And I don't know how many kilometers or miles he came, but it was far.
Yeah.
And he was wearing shoes that had no soles.
Mm.
But he felt like because this was a formal occasion,
Yeah.
he felt like he should put his shoes on.
Right. Yeah. Wow.
So these were the kind of people that I got to meet, and
Mm.
it was a really, really beautiful experience, really rich.
Yeah.
So that was in between us getting married, and then we got married, and then I moved to Switzerland. And back to my childlike naivety, my husband said to me before we got married, he said, "Listen, it's not going to be like where you live," because I've always lived rurally. And we lived on a river, like it was right in our backyard. And he said, "There won't be a river, there won't be a lot of trees. You'll probably have to live in an apartment building." And I said to him, "Oh, that's okay, as long as we can live near the ocean." And he goes, "Terry, there's no ocean in Switzerland."
True.
I was like, "What? What kind of a country has no ocean?"
Oh man, oh, that's funny.
Oh,
Lots of
yeah.
nice lakes, but no ocean. Yeah. Wow. Hmm.
Yes. Yeah. Any questions?
You're answering all of them. But anyway, uh, well,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I know your story continues afterwards, but yeah, I mean, eventually you wind up back in Canada, but and you've been there in British Columbia for how many years now?
We came back in 1997. So we lived in
Wow.
Switzerland for 11 years,
Yeah.
married in 86, and then came here in 97
Wow.
and had two more children in
Yeah.
Switzerland.
It's
And
interesting. We moved, I was a pastor's kid, and so we moved around a lot. Every 3 or 4 years we were moving to a different place. But we moved back here to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, in '97, and we've been here since. So it's
yeah,
the longest I've ever lived anywhere in my life.
well, we didn't move here where we are now
I
in
see.
97. We
I see.
moved we moved to a very remote place actually in British Columbia. It's just below the Yukon border.
Hmm.
And it's tucked in behind the Alaskan Panhandle.
Uh-huh.
Um, and it was in the Coast Mountains. And
Wow.
yeah, we looked for a place that had the least number of roads on the map.
Wow.
And then we went and checked it out. And we loved it, so we we moved there.
Goodness. How long did y'all live there?
We were there for 3 years, and it was three like incredible year. Like it feels like 20. Like the
Wow.
things we learned because we lived without electricity.
Yeah.
We had a radio phone that was hooked up to a solar panel
See.
and and um and also a CB so that we could talk to our neighbors. All the neighbors had CBs. And and we homesteaded. So we
Yeah.
bought a shack and we turned it into a house, and we cleared land and we grew all our own food, and we butchered our own animals, and we milked goats, and
Wow.
we'd never done any of that before.
Goodness.
So yeah, built fences, and it was, yeah,
Hmm.
it was amazing.
So it was on the job training,
It was on the job training, and
and your
it was a matter
survival depended on
of
it.
survival. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
and and when we moved, my oldest daughter was 14.
Hmm.
So she was already in the advanced years of school.
Right.
And the school in Telegraph Creek only went to grade 10, and then they had to go out, what they called going out, just to finish school.
See.
And the government would pay for tuition and room and board, kind of thing for
See.
that.
Wow.
And so my daughter went to my parents in Victoria, which is on Vancouver Island, which is like 3 days drive from where we
Right.
live,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And she finished school there, and then when she was finished, there was really no reason to come home because there was nothing there,
Right. Yeah.
like.
Hmm.
And so that was kind of the thing that made us reconsider being in Telegraph Creek,
Right.
um, because we didn't want to say goodbye to our kids when they were 16, kind of thing.
Yep.
And so we found this place here. We're about 50 kilometers from town. There was a school bus at the time that came down the road, picked the kids up, and they had a 45-minute drive to school, but it
Yep.
was better than 3 days.
Right. For sure. I
Yeah. But we just continued the lifestyle. Like
Yeah.
we just continued to self-sustain. We worked so that we could live. You know, we weren't career oriented, neither one of us.
Hmm.
So my husband would get work for a couple, for a year, and then, or for a few months, and then we'd live on that for a couple of years, and then he'd go get another few months worth of work. And, we
Yeah.
just did everything very, very frugally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did, at your current location, did you like build your own home, and
No.
was there something already there?
Well, there was something here, but it was quite, like, the place was a dump
Yeah.
when we bought it. We came to look at it, and there was a couple renting it,
Yeah.
and they had those aluminum lawn chairs with the nylon webbing. Remember
Right.
those?
Yeah.
That was their living room suite.
Wow.
And I think they were growing pot in the basement because there was a number of rooms we weren't allowed to go into.
I see. Right.
And yeah, so when we moved into this place, it was a log house that was built by a bunch of rowdies in the 70s.
Uh,
And it had no chinking in between the logs.
good.
It was just, yeah. And
Yeah.
then the guy that we bought it from, he bought it and then logged it. And when he logged it, he destroyed all the perimeter fencing.
Mm.
And so where I live, um, I like to tell people I live in the land of cowboys and Indians because it really is.
Yeah.
And so there are range cows everywhere. And you have to basically fence your property to keep them out,
So,
right? It's
yeah.
up to you.
Right.
And so when we first moved here, I remember the first morning we woke up, there was a huge bull right in the front yard calling at the
Come
top of
on.
his lungs.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
That's
So
intimidating.
yeah, we went to work, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Went to work fixing this up, and
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure, I mean, I think I've heard about horses and goats and maybe cows and
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. I always wanted horses,
Yeah.
and um I'd had a couple of unfortunate accidents with horses when I was a kid,
Mm.
and I had this terrible fear, but I loved them so much I wanted to get over it. So
Yeah.
before we moved to Canada, I got a job working in a stables in Switzerland as a groom so that I could get over my fear of horses,
So,
because I determined in my mind that I was going to have horses eventually. And we at the time had no plans to move. I was just preparing, which
right.
I'm like that,
Right.
right? I'm really future oriented,
Yeah.
as you can tell.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then we got, now that's another interesting story, actually, little story in the story, but
Yeah.
I wanted to get two horses, and we were living in Telegraph Creek, and so we drove to a guy who raised Tennessee Walkers because I wanted a Tennessee Walker.
Yep.
And when we left his place, we had four horses because he gave us one, and then he talked me into another one for super cheap. And two of them were pregnant. Okay.
Wow.
So we drive all the way back to Telegraph Creek with these four horses. We have no fences except for just where our goat pen is,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So we stick these four horses in this tiny little goat pen, and we figure tomorrow we'll start building fences.
Right.
And at about 10 o'clock that next morning, my son wakes me up because we got home like at, I don't know, 3 in the morning or something.
Wow.
And he wakes me up and he goes, Mom, Maggie had her baby.
Mm.
So
Wow.
the horses had her full in the goat pen with these
Yeah.
other horses, and she's just terrifying them, right? Trying to keep them
Yeah.
away.
Yeah.
And then a week later, the other horse foaled. So now I have six horses.
Wow.
Okay. And only one of them was broke.
Oh, goodness.
And so I had bought two saddles off the guy that I bought the horses from. And then I bought a book, a training book
Right.
by a guy named John Lyons. So if
Hmm.
anybody listens to this and they're really into horses and training,
Mhm.
they'll know who he is. But
Yeah.
he just wrote this very succinct, very straightforward, very commonsensical book about how to train horses.
Yeah.
And so I literally would take each one of these horses out into the field, into an open field with no fences, okay,
Right.
on a halter. Well, actually, I had to halter break them first,
Yeah.
but then and then read the chapter, starting with chapter 1, put the book down on the ground, try the thing, you know,
Yeah.
and in the end, by the end of that summer, we were riding 3 of them.
Hmm. Wow.
The other 2 were babies, so we couldn't ride those,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So we were, and our neighbors they were just laughing when they heard that we had bought all these horses and they weren't broke.
Right.
And then one day me and the kids were riding them down the road, and the neighbor drove by and he goes, "What are these? Are these the horses you got?" And I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "What? Really?"
Yeah, the
Good book.
last laugh.
Yeah.
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 Wow. Yep. Well, I did want to ask you about a couple of things about you know, your spiritual growth over the years. Obviously, that's a slow metamorphosis that takes place usually in our lives if we're fortunate to live long enough. And
Right.
um, you know, I know that I get the sense that, you know, you were, of course, exposed to kind of the Calvinist and Reformed perspective through the brethren,
Hmm.
but I suspect that it never had much, if any, of a hold on you. Is that correct?
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah. Well,
secret.
it's interesting because the whole idea of election and that some are born to suffer in hell for eternity, it just matched the whole narcissistic hypocrisy that I was looking at.
Yeah,
And that's how I saw it. Okay. I'm not saying that's what it is.
sure.
I don't want to make those, I don't like making like, but this is how I saw it.
Right.
And so I'm going, yeah, wouldn't you just love that idea? Right? That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
And of course I didn't know that there was any options. Like I thought there was a hell, right? And all I knew was was a very strong dispensationalist, Calvinist, I mean the closed brethren, which we could attend, but with lots of caveats. But the closed brethren were even more extreme,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so it was like, and it was all based on the doctrine of election. Like closed brethren assemblies are closed because only the elect can hear the word of God,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Yeah.
Which is the most dismal thing I've ever heard.
Mm. Mm.
You know, didn't Jesus say, go and tell the good news?
Right.
You know, I mean, if you have good news, you just tell everybody. You
Right.
don't
Absolutely.
choose who you get to tell.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Yeah.
think I read somewhere once that in the early days, the closed brethren would literally like they would have to fulfill the Great Commission to go out and preach the gospel. But then they had this other problem with the election, the doctrine of election.
Right.
And so they would form tight circles around the preacher in the park
Huh.
so that people couldn't really hear them.
Right. Yeah.
Like I'm just like,
Yeah.
you know, how ridiculous is that?
Yes.
Anyway, but yeah, I mean, I did fall prey to the idea that I might go to hell, you know, but that was because I didn't know that there were, and I don't think that I won't go to hell, but forever
Yeah.
and to be tormented. right?
Yep.
And but and the first time I heard an option was when I read the Justice Sermon by George MacDonald.
Really. Wow.
And the Consuming Fire sermon.
Yep.
And I was just like, because I knew those things in my heart, but I had never heard anyone dare to say them out loud.
Yeah.
And
Unspoken sermons.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't think he was trying to hide the fact. I just think they took away his pulpit.
Oh yeah.
That's why I think he called it that.
Right. Yeah.
So, but it's like, my husband and I, when we lived in Switzerland, we went to church. We went to a Mennonite Brethren church. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Oh yeah.
But it's a similar setup to the Plymouth Brethren with no pastor and elders and so on.
Right.
Although it was a little more liberal, if you can imagine.
Yeah.
Than the one that I grew up with.
Right.
And every Sunday I would, after the sermon, I would go down for coffee hour or whatever. And in Switzerland, everyone greets by shaking hands, even family members. And people would shake my hand and say, "What's your name again?" And we were there for 9 years.
Wow.
Right. And my husband and I we'd come home so discouraged because we were just looking around going, what is this?
Yeah.
What is this?
Right.
And I was on the worship team, and some stuff happened in the church there that was just really discouraging as well.
Right.
One of the elders left, and
Yep.
And and then we moved to Telegraph Creek, and we met a couple who were hosting a house church. And it didn't matter where you came from as a Christian. You could just go. Although there were no Catholics there. And there were some Catholics in the valley.
Yeah.
But they stayed home and prayed the rosary with their kids.
Right.
So, but it didn't take very long for that, for just strangeness to start popping up, right?
Yeah. Right.
And I remember I said to my husband, I said, "Okay, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm done.
Yeah.
I'm done going to church." And he said, "Me too. We're done."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we came here. We could have gone to church every Sunday. It's not that big of a drive, 45 minutes,
Right. Yeah.
But we didn't.
Yeah.
But we didn't deconstruct, Wayne.
Yeah.
We didn't deconstruct. We both feel like we walked with God in a way that was just not even, I don't know what we were, honestly, well, for myself personally, I was always in conversation. I was always talking to God all the time, even when I was going to church, and I was asking questions, and, but maybe as a result of that, I'm not sure, I couldn't figure out what church life was. I just couldn't figure out what it was.
Yep.
It just felt like a place where you had to listen to someone talk about something in a way that you probably aren't going to agree with fully, and then shake hands with people who don't know your name, and your kids come home crying because Bobby hit them with a brick, and like just like we're just like, what is this?
Yeah.
And so yeah, and I just started having a really deep walk with God, conversation with God.
Right.
And then I remember when Jordan Peterson popped up in the news. I actually heard it on the radio because I wasn't an internet person. Like, I've never had social media. I've never, we had a computer in the house, but the kids could they could watch, do an hour or something, and that was it.
So,
And it was dial up, you
right.
know. And yeah, so, and I'm like, who is this guy?
Yeah.
So, I'm looking him up, and that's actually when I started to watch YouTube, because I started watching his lectures.
Yep.
And I was just, it felt like all the things that I had learned up to that point were all coming, like, they were all gelling into
Mhm.
in some kind of coherent thing,
Right.
you know?
Yep.
And then Paul Vanderklay popped up, and then we started, the Discord server, and then Luke Thompson sent me the Justice Sermon,
Wow.
and he said to me, read this, Shari. And so I did.
Mhm.
And I remember I was sitting on my porch upstairs on a beautiful summer day, and I was reading it out loud, and I just wept.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a like cleansing manner.
Yeah.
Like, it just was like years and years and years of nothing but question marks,
Yep.
you know?
Yep.
It seemed like they all got answered. And
Right.
I'm like, yes,
Yeah.
yes, of course you can't, of course you can't get your watch back. Of course punishing the man doesn't get your watch back.
Right.
I don't know if you know the story
Yeah.
in the Justice Sermon, but he tells the story of a man who stole a man's watch, right?
Yeah.
And that, those were all things that I had thought about and thought, how does this work?
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah.
And of course, the book of Job. I mean, I
Hmm.
read the book of Job, and I remember asking people questions about the book of Job and getting this,
Yeah.
go on, get away from, with that.
Nothing to
And
see here. Move on.
yeah, and I remember thinking, okay, they don't really like this book.
Yeah.
I
Right.
bet if they could, they would get rid of it.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, wonder why.
Right. Yeah.
And so then I just, I dug into it, and I'm like, oh wow, he, we have, and then I started to notice that we had this etiquette around God.
Hmm.
That we had taken the personal, really, you grow up in these evangelical places, and all you hear about is this personal relationship to God, but it's not personal.
Right.
Nobody dares to say the things that Job is saying,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Too true.
Yeah.
Mhm. Well, when this happened with you, and just reading the sermon, Justice, um, was it sort of coincidental, or would you? I don't know exactly how to ask the question, but what I'm interested in is, uh, was there, in some respects, a somewhat decisive moment or time when the whole reality of the poetic imagination, to put it broadly and perhaps vaguely, opened up to you?
Mhm.
Because I know that's really important. Again, that's a label that I would give it. I don't know if you would put it that way per
No,
se.
that's a good way to put it. I've never
Yeah.
thought of it that way, but that's right, because it's a it's a marriage of heaven and earth, right?
Yeah.
Is what you're talking about. And you know, it wasn't just the justice sermon, it's also the consuming fire sermon. So
Yeah.
I actually have a conversation on YouTube with Mary Cohan and Karen Wong
Oh, okay.
and Bethel McGrew and I mentioned the consuming fire,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because like I was so taken aback at the idea that if God is our existence, if everything lives and moves and has its being in God,
Yes.
then he's got to be there too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Otherwise we wouldn't be alive.
That's
We
right.
would cease to exist.
Yep.
Right? And I'm just like, wait a minute.
Right.
And now where was I going with that? The poetic imagination.
Right.
Okay, so I remember thinking after reading that, I was like, well, this goes back to my 5-year-old mystical experience. Okay. Because what I saw, and I'm not really good at describing it because it wasn't like a 3D, you know,
Right.
Technicolor vision,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's something you see in your mind's eye that for some reason you end up thinking in images, I guess. I don't know. But what I saw was the thing. So I had this description of it. It was the thing that was thinking about me thinking, okay, that doesn't die.
Hmm.
And
Mhm.
and it was this sphere and it was glowing, right?
Yeah.
And and it and it moved up into this other cloud, so to speak, but
Mhm.
it formed a like a body, but it
Hmm.
wasn't the shape of a body, human
Right.
body. It was just it formed a body of sorts. Like they were assembling together all
Yeah.
these little orbs, okay?
Yeah.
And and I remember seeing that and thinking, "Oh, there I am. There's where I there's where I," and I watched myself going,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And I remember thinking that's where I belong. That's actually where I belong,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? That's where I came from.
Right.
And I'm going back to where I came from.
Yeah.
And I'm 5,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Right.
And so when all this, realization about apokatastasis started revealing itself to me, unveiling itself to me, I'm
Hmm.
like, I knew this.
Hmm.
This is what God showed me,
Yeah.
right? And I also had another experience that I failed to tell you about, but it was when I was at that school and I had this penetrating question. Why did God put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden? Okay.
Yep.
And I thought it was a really stupid question, but it wouldn't leave me alone,
Right.
And I'm like, I'm sure a million people have asked this question, but I need an answer.
Yeah.
And I just asked every lecturer that showed up, I asked everybody, and
Yeah.
nobody, oh, that's a good question. That's usually what I got, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like, yeah, we've heard that a million times, and who knows?
Right.
And I'm like, but wait a minute. I think that there's a way to know this, right? And I was walking across the room, and I say it like this because it's solidified in my mind, the memory of it.
Mm.
Bunch of laundry in my arms, and in my cabin, and my little 18-month-old was playing on the floor. And I was walking towards the window. I can remember what was out the window. I remember the weather. I remember the smell in the room, everything.
Yeah.
And I had this like whoosh, like of information.
Mm. Hmm.
And I was like, what? No way. And I when I came to, I was on my butt,
Wow.
sitting on the floor with all this laundry in my arms, and I was probably looked like I was, struck by lightning. And I looked at my little girl, and she didn't even look like she hadn't even moved. So it was like
Yeah.
milliseconds,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And I mean, I can't even give you the full download, but
Mm.
essentially it was everything had to be broken in order to be made whole.
Mm.
Okay?
Mm.
Like that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
and then I found out, of course, because I'm part of this online community with wonderful people like yourself and others, that that's what Judaism teaches when it talks about the shattered vessels,
Mm.
right?
Yep.
And and I don't know if you watched the art conference, but there was a beautiful talk by a Japanese artist
I
where he
did.
talks
I
about,
saw that. I think you recommended it to me, but
yeah,
anyway, yes, I saw
that
that.
would have been why, because because I remember thinking, of course, when something is mended, it's stronger than it was before. It's less fragile,
Right.
right?
Yes.
And so when I think about this, Wayne, I think about it in terms of by his wounds we are healed. Okay?
Mm. Yeah.
And I'm not afraid to say that by our wounds we are healed, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think, that's hard to say when you're 25, 35, sometimes even 45. But by the time you're 55, you're like, oh, yeah,
Yeah. Right.
you know,
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
our wounds, we are healed,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And so like, and this is this Japanese art of, I can't remember the name, what Shin something or other, can't remember
Right.
the name, but where they take a broken piece of pottery and they put it back together in a beautiful, artful way that is like, and they meditate on it before they
Mm.
do it, sometimes for
Mm.
years.
Wow. Yeah.
Okay. And then it's sealed back up again with gold,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And what were they on to? They
Yeah.
were on to truth
Yeah.
and goodness and beauty.
Yes.
That's what they were on to,
Right.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so yeah, like I just felt like I came like so full circle, right? I had this little vision as a 5-year-old. I had this information from God when I was, 22.
Yeah.
And then I, like I told you before, I everything after that was dreams and visions and reading my Bible. But my Bible didn't tell me what to do.
Mm-hmm.
It told me who God was.
Yeah.
And but the dreams and visions gave me guidance, right?
Yes.
And yeah, so reading George MacDonald, like I feel, and now that I'm an Orthodox Christian, I actually know that he's really with me.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
You know?
Right.
Um, I just I'm so grateful to him.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm. There's so many things we don't take to be the concrete reality that they really are, you know. It's just like his strength is perfected in our weakness. We don't
That's
we
right.
we confess it, but we don't really believe it, especially when we're in the middle of our weakness. You know, and it doesn't
Right.
feel like there's any strength there at all. It's like, oh God, if we could just believe and trust you in that moment when we feel so empty and incapable or just useless or what have you. But
Yeah.
that other reality is that faithful cloud of witnesses that we are united with, and not just in thought or spiritually,
Memory.
meaning
Yeah.
not really.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, meaning their the book they wrote, or, their biography.
yeah,
Yeah, on that topic, I met a couple in an Orthodox church, and I knew the husband through the Bridges of Meaning Discord server.
yeah.
So he was the one of the first online friends that I actually got to meet.
Wow.
Haven't met very many, actually.
Right.
And it was because of him that I was able to become a catechumen, because he recommended a priest who was at his,
So,
anyway, I went back to visit that parish, and I met him there. And him and his wife, he had been inquiring for many, many, many years, and
yeah,
his wife was just not comfortable with Orthodoxy. She was a Protestant evangelical, and she just couldn't wrap her mind around it.
right.
And when I got there that day, she was there, and she was running around the kitchen, and another lady said to me, yes, they're both catechumens now. And I'm like, really, what the heck happened? Right? What the heck happened?
Yeah.
Well, you know what happened? They had a child and she died.
Oh my. Mm.
And the only place where that child wasn't dead was in the Orthodox Church.
Mm. Mm.
She was very much alive.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
Hmm.
Never heard that. That's mm.
And you know what they did? Every Sunday after church, they went to her grave and they read her George MacDonald's fairy tales.
Wow. That's wonderful.
Hmm.
Yeah. That
And they
reminds, that
and
reminds,
they and,
go
and
ahead.
they told me, I just want to say this too.
Yeah.
Well, they told me that they also know that she is praying for them.
Yeah. Wow.
Hmm.
Mm.
Sorry, I interrupted.
No, no, no. That's fine. Um, it's such a profoundly different perspective.
Hmm.
That's why we do not grieve as the world grieves. That should be one of the
Yes,
chief reasons why. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, I was just listening to something yesterday about Novalis and about how I don't remember, but the gist of it was how we need fairy tales,
Hmm.
you know. And I don't know if you've read or gotten much into uh Novalis or not.
I haven't read. I started Hymns of the Night once,
Yeah,
and but never really went too far with it.
right.
But I wanted to get back to your poetic imagination because I
Yeah,
feel like I kind of sidestepped that.
no,
Um, I did in my mind I wasn't, but I just want to be clear because
yeah,
I know that for the listener it might not be clear. When I say that everything that I, you know, realized in having read The Consuming Fire and the Justice Sermon, for example,
right.
and it tied right back to my experience as a 5-year-old and as a 22-year-old,
Yeah,
right? And those were both mystical
yeah,
experiences. And but they were more real than most of my life. They were the most real things that ever happened to me,
yeah.
right? Um,
Mm,
and that is like when those two things stay separate, you've lost the poetic imagination,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah,
When those two things get thrown together, the words, right?
yeah,
And the symbol, then you have poetic imagination, you
yeah.
know? And Jonathan Pajot explained the word symbolos once, and I'm just like that's what I could see. I could see the mystical experiences being thrown together with all the things that I had learned. And I
Mm-hmm.
learned a lot.
Right.
I learned a lot in Protestant circles because that's what you do.
Sure.
You learn, right? You
Yeah.
memorize scripture and you have references and the book of Romans and you know the book of Hebrews and you know the book
Mhm.
of Acts and
Right.
you know, but the words, the matter and the spirit got thrown together. And to me, that's incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that's what poetic relations are. It's when
Mm-hmm.
the thing becomes alive,
Yeah.
animated, right?
Right.
And
Right.
this is what George MacDonald talks about when he talks about imagination, and poetic relation, right? He's without saying it explicitly, he's talking about incarnation.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is why for me, when people want to, minimize their experiences, now I'm not saying we should chase after
Sure.
experience.
Yeah.
And I can guarantee you that if you do, you won't have any.
Right.
Because anything that's ever happened to me happened out of the blue,
Yeah.
like
Right.
for no apparent reason, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
At least not to me.
Yeah.
Um, but but um, but we live from that. You know, like when you read the Psalms, when you read the book of Esther, when you read the Gospels, these are people's lives. These are their experiences. That's what we're reading about.
Right.
And it's there that they experience God. It's there that they hear from God.
Right.
It's there that they experience revelation,
Yeah.
right? So in the Orthodox Church, they say there is no theology without mysticism,
Mm-hmm.
because it's in the contemplative that you receive revelation from God,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. The great irony, though, to me is that you can become so focused on what personally I think is mistakenly called the Word of God that you miss the Word of God. You know,
Mhm, mhm.
that the letter replaces the Spirit and it's no longer animated by the Spirit. And therefore, it no longer focuses on the living Christ, who is the Word of God. They speak of me, Jesus says.
Well, I got a poem for you
Yeah,
then. Wait, I read it recently on the last live stream that Nate and I did.
yeah.
It's written by Edwin Muir, and it's called The Incarnate One,
Hmm.
and you're gonna really like it. I I'm I'm absolutely positive. Okay, it's not that long.
Okay.
The windless northern surge, the seagulls scream, and Calvin's kirk crowning the barren brae. I think of Giotto the Tuscan shepherd's dream, Christ, man, and creature in their inner day. How could our race betray the image and the incarnate one unmake, who chose this form and fashion for our sake? The word made flesh here is made word again. A word made word in flourish and arrogant crook. See there King Calvin with his iron pen, and God, three angry letters in a book. And there, the logical hook on which the mystery is impaled and bent into an ideological argument.
Hmm.
There's better gospel in man's natural tongue, and truer sight was theirs outside the law, who saw the far side of the cross among the archaic peoples in their ancient awe. In ignorant wonder saw the wooden cross tree on the bare hillside, not knowing that there a God suffered and died. The fleshless word, growing, will bring us down. Pagan and Christian man alike will fall. The auguries say the white and black and brown, the merry and the sad, theorist, lover, all invisibly will fall. Abstract calamity, save for those who can, build their cold empire on the abstract man. A soft breeze stirs, and all my thoughts are blown far out to sea and lost. Yet I know well the bloodless word will battle for its own invisibly in brain and nerve and cell. The generations tell their personal tale. The one has far to go, past the mirages and the murdering snow.
Hmm. Wow. That's
I'll send you it.
crazy. Yeah. Yeah. That's just as poetry only can do. It says so much in so few words, so to speak.
Well,
Um,
you were just alluding to that the verse in here where you said the word made flesh is here, word made word again, right?
yeah.
A word made word and flourish an arrogant crook. See there King Calvin with his iron pen, and God, three angry letters in a book.
Right.
And there the logical hook on which the mystery is impaled and bent into an ideological argument.
Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely. You abstract the living reality out of.
right out of it. Just wring it
Yeah.
right out.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's, yeah. To me, it's I mean, I see it now, of course, but when I was a Calvinist for 15 years, I could never have recognized it. I don't think, because I
No.
was so intently focused on what I considered the Word of God that I missed the Word, the living Word of God, Jesus Christ, in some significant way. You know, of course, I had faith. I believe it was real, but still, it was like, yeah, I don't know. It's just a whole frame of mind, a whole approach to Scripture, your understanding of Scripture and how it functions, and what was God's intention in it. Uh, you know, it's just it is, yeah, it's the letter spirit battle to me that
Yeah. Yeah, like I watched people, good people who love God and want to share the gospel, as they
yeah,
say,
right,
study the word with a microscope,
yeah,
you know.
yeah,
And 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 then I don't know, it's just weird. I don't want to sound judgmental, but I just don't I just saw a lot of dead men walking.
yeah,
That's what I saw.
yeah,
And and I can't help that I saw that, right? Like, and I would try to shake it off.
yeah,
I would say, no, 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 that's just, you shouldn't judge like that. But I, and Jesus talks about that. He says things like, let the dead bury the dead.
yeah,
And, they're like whitewashed tombs, right? And um there was too much wanton, vengeful death and destruction for it to be God
mm, yeah,
for me.
right, yeah,
Like I said before, like when I read the Bible, I was falling in love with Christ.
mm-hmm,
I was
yep,
learning who God was,
right,
right? Who is God?
yeah,
Like that was my question.
yeah, yeah,
And 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 um and then I'd look out and I'd see and they'd say, "Here is God." And I'd say, "Not that one."
right, yeah,
And that's really how like when I first heard about universalism, and I don't like using the term because it
yeah,
because of because of the kind of universalism that I'm not talking about. You know what I mean?
right,
I
yeah,
like to say I like to say the reconciliation of all
yeah,
things, right?
right, right,
Because when and I said this recently when I realized that it was something that people have talked about, I was like that, because then they were holding up and saying, "Here is God," and I was going, "That is God,"
mm-hmm,
right?
yeah,
I was recognizing because I already had that God in my mind, and people were holding up this other God, and I was contrasting the image of God that I had come to know through knowing him,
right, right,
not reading about him, but
yeah,
through conversations that I had with him, right? And they'd say, "Here is God," and I'd say, "No, no, no, that's not God.
yeah,
It's not the one I know. You
right,
know,
yeah,
let's move on."
yeah, yeah,
Right. And so then when I read Origin, Gregory of Nyssa, I'm like, yes, this is God.
yes,
This is God.
yes, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. I was just recently in a it wasn't a hot debate, but it was definitely a disagreement with a blogger, who's very academic, very much smarter than I am, sure, um, but he was contending. Well, he brought our disagreement down to one question, in which was essentially, what do you do with this verse, which was the verse that says would have been better for Judas had he not been born.
Hmm.
And the thought occurred to me that behind every verse of scripture another question, a question is being whispered, and
Mhm.
it is, who do you say I am?
That's right.
So there's a profound way in which Scripture can be used by the Spirit to penetrate and dividing us under the thoughts and intentions of our hearts, as
Amen.
opposed to revealing some systematic schema of who God is and his
Yep.
attributes, etc. It's like it's penetrating and judging us in a sense of our judgments that we make of Scripture, and then answering the question, who do we say God is? And but because to me, you could never say God is a God who cannot save Judas, because I believe he loved Judas, to the very end and afterwards as well. And so, yeah. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Like that question, who do you say that I am? I've thought about that too in recent days.
Mm,
It's actually just come running through my mind. Who do
mm,
you say that I am?
mm,
Right.
yeah.
And the beautiful thing about that question is you better get it right. He's not saying like you better get it right
Right,
or right.
right, right.
He wants to know
Yeah.
because and this is like the conversation God has with Job at the end, the speech that everyone thinks God is like, pull up your pants and I'm, gonna tell you how it is, right?
Right.
God's like, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah.
And Job's like, no, no. And then God says, okay, now I'm going to speak.
Right.
And then basically he says, he's answering that question, who do you say that I am? Right?
Yeah.
Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? Right?
Mm,
All the rest of it.
mm-hmm.
And essentially Job doesn't know anything,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Like he says, I've spoken of things too wonderful for me,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I hear the question, who do you say that I am? I say, I don't know who you are.
Mm,
'Cause that's the only honest thing I could say.
mm-hmm. Yep.
I don't know, but
Yeah.
I know that you love me
Right.
and I know that you're good.
Right.
And those are the two things that I've only that those are the things that have carried me,
Yep.
Wayne.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, those are my fundamentals. I'm a fundamentalist when it comes to those two things. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and all the talk of, proving God's existence or
Yeah.
did Jesus die? Did he resurrect and was he born and
Right.
what did
Right.
he have for breakfast and you know all the rest of it doesn't matter to me.
Yeah.
It does not matter to me
Mm.
because when God says, "Who do you say that I am?" He's asking you that question. It's not something he needs to know,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
He's asking you to formulate that.
Yeah.
And whatever you formulate is okay. Because even Job said, I don't know, right? Meanwhile,
Right.
he's talking to him,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
God shows up in a whirlwind and Job just says, I'm just going to put my hand on my mouth because he is the name that you cannot name. He is the ineffable one,
Right.
right?
Right.
And to assume that and this is the problem with certainty for me,
Yeah.
right? Is to make God small and insignificant and to make yourself large and very significant.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really that's the action that's happening there.
Mm-hmm. Right. Too true. Well, Sherry, you've been so generous with your time, and I so appreciate you just sharing the way you have from your heart, and it's always a blessing. That's why I love us. You're. I have to say, you're the biggest reason I still like listening to Grail Country is to see you on there, and I love
Oh, thank you.
Nate, and I love all the rest of the guys. But
Yeah.
yeah, I always look forward to hearing what all of you have to say, of course. But anyway, just thank you again. for
Well, thanks for inviting me, Wayne.
uh,
And I'm always really blessed by the things that you share too. I've watched a number of your videos, and
appreciate
I envy in a good way. I envy your biblical knowledge.
it.
I have I was, I spent years, this one church that we went to was a non-denominational church.
Mhm.
Um, but we basically had the same curriculum as Dallas Theological Seminary
So
every Sunday.
yeah, yeah,
No, seriously,
yeah,
I'm serious.
yeah.
And because the pastor of that, there was a pastor at this church, and he was a graduate from Dallas, and he was a self-made, self-declared, um, um, like the church was not just a church, but it was also a school. And he advertised it as getting a degree from Dallas without paying the cost,
Oh,
right?
I see.
But
Yeah,
it was kind of a cult,
yeah,
actually, to be
yeah.
honest. But the
Right.
teaching was amazing.
Yeah,
And he did go by the book,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And when I went there at a time where I was more open and receptive,
Right.
to the things that I was learning.
Right.
And and there was a time where you know, I could quote and reference and all the rest. And I kind of gave it up. I
Yep.
felt like I was supposed to actually
Yep.
um let it go, you know,
Right.
because I needed to know the word made flesh.
Yep.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah.
But I do really appreciate a lot all the insights
Thank
that you share, and the way that you tie scriptures together. And I'm reminded again, because I know those things, but I've forgotten them,
you. Yeah. Yeah.
and so I really love it. Like
Yeah.
I actually think I wish I could just go to a Bible study at Wayne's house.
Well, I'm very flattered and honored by by those words,
Yeah.
but thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and yeah, I tell basically everybody I talk to, pray for me. It's like I've been so struggling with this introduction to the fellowship of the mystery or the
Oh
mystery
yeah.
of Christ. It's like I so want to like keep it to like maybe 15 minutes of an introduction. And it's like every time I sit down to write about it, I wind up with, a couple of hours of material, that type of thing. Not that it's all good material, but
Yeah, yeah,
still
yeah.
it's like,
You gotta pare it down.
I like to say, all the riches that are hidden in Christ. Well, it's an
Yes.
embarrassment of riches. This is
Yeah.
so much. And of
Yeah,
course,
well, please don't hold back for my sake.
well,
Like,
thank you. Well,
yeah.
yeah, I don't know. Yep. Yeah, like I say, pray for me because anybody that speaks will tell you, preacher or whatever,
Yeah.
it's easy to preach for 3 hours, but it's hard to preach for 15 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you really gotta think about it,
Right.
sense everything. But
Yeah.
again, thank you, Sherry. Just thank you so much. And I hope
Yeah, it's
that
my
we can
pleasure.
do this again in the future and catch up. And now that we have your biography, we can then maybe focus on other
Other
things.
things. That would be
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I
Thanks for
really
having me.
enjoyed it. And give your husband my regards and
Will do.
look forward to seeing you again real soon.